Frank Holloway, a silent homeless man in Riverside Park, is dismissed as old ghost by passersby. Unknown to all, he was once the commander of Echo Unit 6, a special forces team lost in the Vietnam War. Liam, a curious 12-year-old, spots Frank's mysterious bracelet and digs into its origins, uncovering a heroic past. When Liam shares this with his veteran grandfather, the truth unravels. Veterans begin saluting Frank, and whispers spread through town. Who is this man everyone ignored? What secrets lie behind his quiet gaze? The town is about to discover a truth long buried. If Frank's story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts below. Have you met someone like Frank? Help us keep these forgotten stories alive. Your support means the world. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. In the heart of Riverside Park, where the city's pulse thrummed with joggers, dog walkers, in the hum of urban life, an old man lay curled on a weathered bench. His frail frame was draped in a tattered army jacket, its olive green fabric faded to a ghostly shade, barely shielding him from the biting morning chill. His hands trembled, not just from the cold but from the weight of years etched into his bones. Frank Holloway, 76, was a fixture in the park, as unremarkable to passersby as the cracked sidewalks or the gnarled elm trees casting long shadows over the grass. To the neighborhood, he was the old ghost, a nickname whispered with a mix of pity and dismissal. He moved with a quiet grace, almost invisible, as if the world had long ago forgotten him, or he had chosen to slip through its cracks. Each dawn, before the sun could fully breach the horizon, Frank stirred. He sat upright, his posture rigid despite the ache in his joints, and fixed his gaze on the sky. His eyes, clouded with age but sharp with unspoken purpose, traced something beyond the clouds, something no one else could see. For several minutes he remained still, a statue carved from solitude. Then, in a voice so soft it was swallowed by the morning breeze, he whispered words no one could decipher. Was it a prayer, a confession, a memory clawing its way to the surface? No one knew. Some speculated he was speaking to Guan. Others thought he was lost in the labyrinth of his own mind. A few, hardened by the city's cynicism, dismissed it as the ramblings of a broken man. But Frank's ritual was unwavering, rain or shine, as if the sky held answers he alone could hear. The park was a theater of indifference. Teenagers strutted past, their laughter cutting through the air like shards of glass, oblivious to the man on the bench. A city worker, sweeping cigarette butts and soda cans, glanced at Frank and muttered under his breath, "Been here forever, just part of the trash now." The words hung heavy, unnoticed by the man they described, who seemed to exist in a world apart. By noon, a security guard was summoned to deal with the problem. The guard's boots thudded against the pavement, his radio crackling with the impatience. "Move along, old man," he barked, his voice laced with the authority of routine. Frank didn't argue. He gathered his belongings, a canvas backpack worn thin at the seams, a small metal tin sealed with duct tape, and the faint glint of dog tags hidden beneath his layers, and shuffled away. No one offered a hand, no one met his eyes. Only whispers trailed behind him, tinged with disgust or fleeting pity. Yet Frank was not like the others who drifted through the park's edges. He didn't beg, didn't hold a cardboard sign scrawled with pleas for help. If someone extended $1, he'd nod politely, his weathered face creasing into a faint smile, and wave it away. Offers of food, though, he accepted with quiet dignity, especially from Leo's diner across the street. Every evening, as the neon sign flickered to life, a young waitress named Maria would slip out with a brown paper bag. Inside were scraps of the day's leftovers, a slice of toast, a crumbling biscuit, or, on lucky days, half a turkey sandwich. She'd leave it near the park's entrance, never lingering, never expecting thanks. Frank would retrieve it silently, vanishing into the trees like a shadow reclaiming its place. Beneath his stoic exterior, Frank carried a universe of unspoken pain. The dog tags around his neck, worn smooth by decades of touch, were a tether to a life he rarely acknowledged. They bore his name, his blood type, and a serial number that hinted at a past of service, but he never spoke of it. Inside his sleeping bag, barely visible through the frayed stitching, was a faded insignia, an emblem that might have once meant something to someone, but now it was just another relic of a forgotten man. Occasionally, other veterans passed through the park, their eyes heavy with shared ghosts. Some would pause, offering a nod or a crisp salute from across the path. Frank never returned the gesture. His face would tighten, a flicker of something, regret, shame, or maybe pride, crossing his features before he turned away. The city moved on, indifferent to the man who had made Riverside Park his home. To most, Frank was invisible, a relic of a world they didn't care to understand. But exactly 24 hours after the security guard's dismissal, the sky above the park roared to life. A Black Hawk helicopter descended, its blades slicing through the air, kicking up whirlwinds of dust and leaves. The ground trembled as startled joggers froze, their earbuds dangling. Teenagers gawked, phones already raised to capture the spectacle. Soldiers spilled out, their boots pounding the earth, their gear clinking with purpose. From the crowd, a high-ranking officer emerged, his uniform crisp, his stride deliberate. He made straight for the bench where Frank sat, his frail form dwarfed by the chaos around him. The officer stopped, snapped to attention, and saluted. "Sir, we've been looking for you," he said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. The crowd fell quiet. Phones wavered in trembling hands. Whispers dissolved into a collective hush. The same people who had scorned Frank, who had called him trash, now stared in disbelief. Who was this man they had dismissed as nothing? What secrets had he carried all these years, hidden beneath his tattered jacket and quiet rituals? As the soldiers flanked him, their faces grim with respect, the truth began to dawn. Frank Holloway was no ghost. He was a man whose story was about to unravel, and the world was finally listening. Frank Holloway sat on his usual bench in Riverside Park, his silhouette a familiar fixture beneath the sprawling branches of an old oak. His shoulders, perpetually hunched from years of carrying an unseen weight, would subtly lift whenever a breeze stirred the leaves above or a distant plane carved a fleeting scar across the sky. There was a quiet dignity in his bearing, a disciplined stillness that hinted at a life once bound by structure and purpose, a life where boots were polished to a mirror shine and orders were followed without question. In his mind, the uniform he'd once worn still clung to him, its weight both a comfort and a curse. To the people who passed through the park, though, Frank was little more than a shadow in tattered clothes, the old homeless guy parents warned their children to steer clear of. Joggers gave his bench a wide berth, their eyes sliding past him as if he were part of the scenery, a weathered statue, not a man. Every so often, security guards from the nearby shopping center would approach, their voices gruff with practiced authority, urging him to move along. But Frank always returned, drawn back to this exact spot, this precise angle of earth where he could tilt his head and watch the heavens. No one knew where he disappeared to on the days he vanished, sometimes for a night, sometimes two. But he always came back, his backpack neatly tucked beside him, his sleeping bag folded with military precision across his knees. He spoke to no one. He asked for nothing. Yet every morning his eyes traced the sky with a quiet intensity, as if he were waiting for a signal, a visitor, or perhaps a redemption that had yet to arrive. In his heart, a flicker of hope, or maybe stubborn defiance, kept him anchored to that bench, searching the clouds for something he couldn't name. On a Tuesday morning, the park buzzed with more life than usual. The sun had finally pierced through a week of gray, heavy clouds, bathing the grass in a warm, golden glow that drew people out like moths to a flame. Students lounged on blankets, their textbooks forgotten as they laughed too loudly to fill the air with their youth. Couples strolled, hand in hand, sharing sandwiches and soft whispers during early lunch breaks. And then there were the teenagers, 5 of them, 3 boys and 2 girls, all hovering around 16 or 17, their voices sharp and carefree as they roamed the park's edge. One boy, his neon green hoodie glaring against the softer tones of spring, held his phone aloft, filming with the exaggerated swagger of someone chasing internet fame. "Yo, check it out, people," he announced to his imaginary audience, his voice dripping with mock bravado. "We're live from Riverside Park, and guess who we've got here? The old ghost himself in his natural habitat." His camera swiveled toward Frank's bench, zooming in with unsteady focus on the man who sat as still as stone, his eyes fixed on the sky. Frank wasn't sleeping. Never sleeping during the day, as if rest were a luxury he'd long forsaken. His weathered hands rested lightly on his sleeping bag, his backpack a loyal companion at his side. The boy with the phone raised his voice, goading, "Say something, man! You alive or what?" His friends erupted into laughter, their voices sharp and careless, slicing through the morning air. One of the girls, her ponytail swinging as she leaned forward, smirked and added, "Maybe he's a robot. Look at him, he doesn't even blink." Another boy, lanky and eager to one-up her, chimed in, "Nah, he's not a robot. He's a leftover, like from the last century or something." The group howled, their laughter a chaotic symphony of cruelty and boredom. One of them, emboldened by the moment, kicked a pebble toward Frank's bench. It skittered across the path and landed at his feet, a small, meaningless act of provocation. Frank didn't flinch. His gaze remained skyward, unyielding, as if the pebble and the laughter were beneath his notice. "Dude, this is gold," the boy with the phone declared, his eyes gleaming with the prospect of viral glory. "This is gonna blow up online." The group circled closer, their taunts growing bolder. They mimicked Frank's posture, slouching and straightening in exaggerated parody, their laughter swelling with each jab. One of the girls, her confidence fueled by the group's energy, dropped to the grass in a theatrical imitation of Frank's cross-legged stillness, tilting her head skyward with a dramatic flourish. "Bet he's waiting for alien spaceships to beam him up," she said, her voice thick with mockery. Her friends doubled over, clutching their sides as if her words were the pinnacle of wit. Inside, though, the girl felt a flicker of unease, a tiny nagging voice that wondered if Frank could hear them, if he cared, if he was even human enough to feel the sting of their words. She pushed the thought away, letting the group's laughter drown it out. The boy with the phone kept filming, his narration growing louder, more reckless, as if he could will the moment into something bigger than it was. To them, Frank was a prop, a fleeting amusement in Blanco in their careless cruelty, unaware of the weight of their actions. Then came Leo, the daytime security guard from the shopping center across the street. In his late 50s, heavy-set and carrying the weary air of a man who'd seen too many long shifts, Leo wore a badge that held no real power, but gave him just enough clout to command attention. His belt creaked as he adjusted it, his voice booming across the park. "What's going on here?" The teenagers froze, their bravado faltering under his stern gaze. Nervous laughter spilled from them as they backed away, one of the boys muttering, "Just talking to the old guy." Leo's eyes flicked to Frank, then back to the group. "You've made your point. Move along." His tone was firm, the kind that brooked no argument. The kids exchanged glances, their smirks fading as they shuffled off down the path. One of them, the boy in the hoodie, couldn't resist a final gesture, a mocking salute tossed in Frank's direction as they disappeared into the distance. Leo watched them go, his jaw tight with irritation. Then he turned to Frank, his expression softening into something like reluctant sympathy. "Frank," he said, his voice heavy with the so, "you know how it is. We've had complaints. Families get nervous. People just want to enjoy the park." Frank didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the sky, as if Leo's words were no more significant than the breeze. Inside, though, a faint tremor of something stirred. Anger, perhaps, or weariness. He'd heard it all before, the complaints, the concerns, the polite and not so polite requests to disappear. But this was his place, his piece of earth, where the sky felt closer and the waiting felt bearable. Leo shifted his weight, his hands resting on his hips. "I've got to call this in," he continued, his tone apologetic but resolute. "Park rules, you know." He hesitated as if waiting for Frank to protest, to explain himself, to offer something human. But Frank gave him nothing, his silence a wall that Leo couldn't breach. Inside, Frank's mind churned with memories he kept locked away, memories of a life where he'd had a purpose, a name, a place. Now he was just the old man on the bench, invisible to the world except as an inconvenience. Yet every morning he returned, driven by a quiet, unshakable conviction that whatever he was waiting for was still out there, somewhere beyond the clouds. The weight of the city's demands pressed heavily on the supervisors. a directive that left no room for debate. Clear out anyone who didn't belong. Leo, a park worker with years of routine etched into his movements, didn't hesitate. His radio crackled to life as he relayed the order, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet reluctance he'd never admit. He stood by the edge of Riverside Park, watching the world move on around him, joggers weaving through the paths, kids shrieking on the playground, and the distant hum of traffic. Less than 10 minutes later, a patrol car rolled up to the curb, its tires crunching softly against the gravel. Two officers stepped out, their presence shifting the air. The younger one, barely out of training, had a nervous energy, his eyes darting as if unsure how to navigate this part of the job. His partner, older and weathered, carried the exhaustion of a man who'd spent decades delivering the same tired script. Move along, keep going, don't stay here. Stay. His face, lined and hardened, held no cruelty, just the dull ache of repetition. The older officer approached Frank Holloway, who sat on his usual bench beneath a sprawling oak, its branches casting dappled shadows across his worn coat. "Sir," the officer began, his tone firm but not unkind, "I'm going to need you to gather your things. You can't stay here anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Frank didn't argue or protest. He never did. His body, stiff from years of chronic pain that gnawed at his joints, moved slowly as he leaned forward. Each motion was deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if he were performing a ritual he'd perfected over time. He reached for his sleeping bag first, its fabric frayed and patched but folded with the precision of a soldier who'd once known discipline as a second language. He smoothed it carefully, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the quiet dignity he refused to let slip away. Next came the canvas backpack, faded but meticulously clean, a testament to Frank's stubborn pride in maintaining what little he had. He packed it methodically, his fingers lingering on the worn straps as if they held memories too heavy to carry. From beneath the bench, he retrieved two items that seemed to anchor him to a life long gone. The first was a pair of combat boots, their leather cracked and soles worn thin, yet the laces were tied in perfect symmetrical knots, a small act of defiance against the chaos of his circumstances. The second was a tarnished military badge, its edges chipped, one corner missing entirely. It was a relic of another time, held together by a makeshift key ring and a thin strand of wire. Frank handled it with reverence, his eyes tracing its surface as if it were a map to a place he could never return to. He tucked it carefully into the backpack, ensuring it was safe, protected from the world that had long since stopped caring. The officer stood in silence, watching. The younger one shifted uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting at his sides, unsure whether to speak or act. The older officer's gaze softened just a fraction, recognizing something in Frank's quiet resolve that he'd seen in others over the years. Men and women who carried their past like invisible weights. They didn't mock him, didn't offer help. They simply waited, granting him the space to complete his task with the dignity he clung to. When Frank was ready, he slung the backpack over his shoulder, the motion slow but steady, as if he'd rehearsed this moment countless times. He gave a single nod, not to the officers, but to the bench, the tree, the park itself. A farewell to the only place that had felt like home in years. Then he began to walk, his steps measured, his posture unyielding despite the pain that radiated through his body. The park bustled around him, indifferent. A hot dog vendor glanced up from his cart, his eyes flickering with recognition before he turned back to his work, unwilling to linger on the sight of a man being erased from the landscape. A woman on her lunch break, engrossed in her phone, scrolled through messages, oblivious to the quiet tragedy unfolding just feet away. A mother tugged her child closer, her lips moving in a hushed warning about those kinds of people, her voice laced with fear and judgment. To them, Frank was just another shadow in a city that had grown accustomed to looking through people like him, seeing only the dirt on their clothes and not the stories etched in their eyes. Frank didn't falter. He didn't turn back. His gaze remained fixed ahead, carrying a quiet strength that refused to be diminished. As he passed through the gates of Riverside Park, the bench where he'd spent every morning seemed to shrink in his absence, the space quieter, emptier, as if the park itself had lost something vital. For most, Frank Holloway was just another forgotten figure, a man whose existence barely registered. But to Liam Carson, a 12-year-old boy who lived 2 blocks away, he was something far more profound. Liam's world revolved around the rhythm of his daily bike rides through Riverside Park, the winding past a shortcut on his way home from school. At first, Frank had been just another part of the scenery, a quiet, solitary man under a tree, someone to be curious about but keep at a distance. Like most people, Liam had felt a twinge of unease, a mix of curiosity and caution fed by the stories adults told about strangers like Frank. But Liam was different. He didn't just pass by him, he watched. He noticed the small, deliberate things, the way Frank folded his sleeping bag with care, as if it were a flag being prepared for a ceremony, the way he never left so much as a crumb behind, keeping his corner of the park as tidy as a home, the way he never asked for anything, his silence louder than any plea. Liam saw the man beneath the worn coat, the one who carried himself with a quiet pride that no one else seemed to notice. One day, Liam's curiosity turned to action. He'd seen Frank eating nothing but a crust of bread, pulled from a crumpled paper bag, and something in the boy's chest tightened, a mix of pity and a need to do something, anything, to make a difference. The next morning, he packed an extra peanut butter and jelly sandwich in his backpack, the bread slightly squished but made with care. After school, he rode through the park, his heart pounding as he approached Frank's bench. He didn't know what to say, didn't know if he should say anything at all, so he didn't. He simply placed the sandwich, wrapped in a brown paper bag, near Frank's feet and pedaled away, his cheeks burning with a mix of nervousness and pride. Frank looked up, his eyes meeting Liam's for the briefest moment, and gave a faint nod, a gesture so small it might have been missed, but to Liam, it felt like a bridge had been built between them. Frank returned to staring at the sky, his expression unreadable. But the sandwich was gone the next time Liam passed by. It became a ritual. Every other day, Liam brought something, a half sandwich, an apple, a granola bar, small offerings that felt monumental to a boy who had little to give. Frank never refused, but he never spoke much either. His silence wasn't cold. It was heavy, layered with years of loss and resilience that Liam was too young to fully understand but old enough to feel. Each time Liam left something, he'd linger just a moment longer, hoping for a word, a story, a glimpse into the man who seemed to carry a world within him. And each time, Frank's faint nod or fleeting glance was enough to keep Liam coming back. A quiet connection forming between a boy searching for purpose and a man who'd long since stopped expecting kindness. In the quiet sprawl of the park, where autumn leaves pirouetted in the crisp breeze, Frank Holloway sat on his usual bench, a solitary figure etched against the fading daylight. There was something about Frank, an unspoken gravity, a quiet dignity that clung to him like the weathered coat he wore. His presence wasn't loud or demanding, yet it carried a weight, as if each step he took was measured with purpose, each glance heavy with stories untold. His eyes, often fixed on some distant point beyond the horizon, seemed to hold secrets too vast for the small town around him to contain. Liam, a lanky teenager with a curious streak, had noticed Frank before. The man was a fixture in the park, as constant as the oak trees or the cracked pavement winding through it. But that afternoon, as the golden hues of fall painted the ground, Liam lingered longer than usual. He stood by his bike, one foot propped on a pedal, watching Frank with a mix of intrigue and hesitation. The old man's gaze was lost in the clouds, his weathered hands resting in his lap. Then, Liam's eyes caught something, a tattered cloth bracelet clinging to Frank's wrist. It was unremarkable at first glance, a faded strip of fabric, its edges frayed from years of wear. But a closer look revealed a faint symbol stitched in dark green thread, a falcon, sharp and proud, nestled within a triangle. The image snagged Liam's curiosity like a hook. "What's that?" Liam asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. He pointed at the bracelet, his tone casual but laced with genuine interest. Frank's head tilted slowly, as if the question had pulled him back from some far-off memory. His eyes dropped to the bracelet, and for a moment he seemed surprised to see it there, as though it were a relic from a life he'd nearly forgotten. Then for the first time in days, a faint smile cracked the stoic mask of his face. It wasn't a joyful smile, but one tinged with a quiet ache, like the flicker of a candle in a storm. "It's a gift," Frank said, his voice low and deliberate, each word seeming to rise from a deep, buried place within him. "From who?" Liam pressed, leaning closer, his curiosity now a living thing, restless and demanding. Frank's pause was long, his gaze drifting back to the ski as if the clouds held the answers he wasn't ready to give. "My team," he said finally, the words heavy with a reverence that made Liam's chest tighten. "We each had one, made them ourselves, before we left." "Left where?" Liam's question hung in the air, but Frank didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the heavens, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost a whisper. "Not all of us came home." The weight of those words settled over Liam like a fog. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to reach into the silence that followed. Frank's face was unreadable, but there was a rawness in his expression, a flicker of grief, of pride, of something Liam couldn't quite name. He nodded, unsure what else to do, then swung onto his bike and pedaled home, the rhythm of the wheels doing little to quiet the thoughts swirling in his mind. That falcon, that triangle, it clung to him, vivid and unshakable, like a puzzle piece from a picture he couldn't yet see. That night, Liam couldn't sleep. The bracelet haunted him, its faded threads weaving through his thoughts. Who was Frank, really? Why did that simple piece of cloth feel like it carried the weight of 1,000 stories? Unable to shake the image, he grabbed his tablet, the blue glow of the screen cutting through the darkness of his room. His fingers flew across the keyboard, typing every detail he could recall. Falcon triangle patch military cloth bracelet. The search results flooded in, most of them useless. Ads for custom patches, craft blogs, irrelevant forums. But then, buried in the digital noise, one image stopped him cold. It was a grainy photograph on an archived military forum, time-stamped years ago, frozen in time. A group of men in camouflage stood in front of a helicopter, their faces stern but proud. On each of their wrists was a bracelet, identical to Frank's, simple, worn with that same falcon in a triangle stitched in green. The caption beneath the photo read, "Echo Unit 6, 1978, last photo before Operation Rainfire." Liam's heart thudded in his chest as he clicked deeper, chasing the thread of the story. The more he read, the stranger and heavier it became. Echo Unit 6 was no ordinary squad. It was a Special Forces reconnaissance team sent into the dense jungles of Southeast Asia on a classified mission. The declassified fragments of the report painted a grim picture. The entire unit had vanished during Operation Rainfire. Official records marked them as missing in action, presumed dead. No survivors were ever confirmed. Liam's eyes lingered on the photo, on the bracelets that matched Frank's so perfectly. His mind raced. Could it be? Was the quiet, weathered man in the park, one people dismissed as just another homeless drifter, actually one of them? Or worse, the last one? The thought kept Liam awake, his mind a tangle of questions and half-formed theories. Frank didn't seem like an ordinary man, not with that bracelet, not with the way his eyes carried a quiet storm. Whatever he had lived through, it wasn't over. Not for him. The weight of that realization pressed on Liam, heavy and urgent. The next morning, over a breakfast of eggs and toast, Liam couldn't keep it to himself. The words spilled out as he sat across from his grandfather, Robert Carson, a man whose own past was a closed book. Robert was a Vietnam veteran, his time in the U.S. Army a chapter he rarely opened. His hands, rough and steady from years of labor, paused midair as Liam described the bracelet, the falcon, the triangle, the faded green thread. Robert's fork hovered, forgotten, as his eyes narrowed. "Say that again," he said, his voice sharp, cutting through the morning quiet. Liam repeated the details, watching his grandfather's face tighten with recognition. Without a word, Robert pushed his plate aside and stood, his movements deliberate, almost mechanical. He crossed the room to a corner of the living room where an old wooden box sat, its surface worn smooth by time, adorned with faded stickers from army bases long since shuttered. He opened it with care, as if it held something fragile, and rummaged through a small bundle of papers. After a moment, he pulled out a single laminated page, its edges yellowed but intact, and handed it to Liam. "Look at the name at the bottom," Robert said, his voice low, almost reverent. Liam squinted at the faded print, his pulse quickening. There, in faint but unmistakable letters, was the name, CPT Frank Holloway, Echo 6. His breath caught in his throat. The room seemed to shrink around him, the air thick with the weight of what he'd uncovered. Frank Holloway wasn't just a man in a park. He was a ghost from a war long over, a survivor of a mission that had swallowed his team whole. And now, Liam realized, the story was far from finished. Frank eased himself onto the weathered bench at Riverside Park, his movements slow and deliberate, as though the weight of decades pressed down on his frail frame. His hands trembled slightly, not from the chill of the morning air, but from the flood of memories that had haunted him for years. In his mind, he saw the face of a man he'd long believed was lost to the jungles of Vietnam, a ghost from a war that had never truly let him go. "I thought he was dead," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible, cracked with disbelief and a flicker of hope he hadn't dared to feel in years. The words hung in the air, fragile and heavy, as if speaking them aloud might shatter the fragile reality he was beginning to grasp. Without hesitation, as if guided by instinct, Frank reached for the old rotary phone in his pocket, a relic he carried more out of habit than necessity. His fingers, gnarled and stiff, dialed a number he hadn't touched in over a decade, each digit etched into his memory like a scar. When the line connected, a familiar voice answered, rough but warm, stirring emotions Frank had buried deep. "Eddie," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "I need you to come to Riverside Park. There's someone you need to see." He hung up before his emotions could betray him, his heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and dread. What if he was wrong? What if this was just another cruel trick of his aging mind? Within the hour, Robert and Liam stood across the street from Frank's bench, their eyes fixed on the old man seated beneath the sprawling oak tree. Robert's breath caught in his throat as he watched Frank, the man who had once been a towering figure in his life, now reduced to a quiet, solitary presence. The sight stirred a deep ache in his chest. Grief for the years lost, guilt for assuming the worst, and a faint spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, the past could be reclaimed. Liam, younger but no less affected, stood rigid beside him, his jaw tight as he wrestled with his own emotions. He'd heard stories of Captain Frank Holloway, the commander who had vanished, presumed dead, after the chaos of June 6. To see him now, alive, felt like standing at the edge of a miracle. Frank sat motionless, his gaze tilted upward, as if searching the sky for answers only he could see. He didn't acknowledge the two men across the street, but Robert didn't need him to. The moment was too sacred for words. Slowly, deliberately, Robert raised his hand in a salute, his arms steady despite the tremor in his heart. It was a gesture of respect, of gratitude, of unspoken apologies for all the years they'd thought him gone. Frank's eyes flicked toward him for the briefest moment, a subtle acknowledgement that carried the weight of 1,000 words. It was enough. For Robert, it was everything. Word of Frank's presence spread like wildfire through the small town, carried on the whispers of veterans who knew the cost of war better than most. By that afternoon, 2 more elderly men arrived at the park, their faded military ball caps pulled low over weathered faces. They stood in silence across the path from Frank's bench, their postures rigid with a reverence that needed no explanation. Each man raised a hand in a solemn salute, their eyes glistening with a mixture of pride and sorrow. They didn't speak to Frank, didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. Their presence was their tribute, their silence a testament to the bond forged in battle. The next morning, the park saw 5 more veterans arrive, then 7 more by noon. By the end of the second day, over a dozen men had come, each drawn by the quiet call of duty and memory. They were men who hadn't touched their uniforms in decades, yet they pulled them from dusty closets, pressed wrinkled jackets, and polished tarnished pins with trembling hands. Each one stood before Frank, now believed to be Captain Frank Holloway, the missing commander of June 6, and offered a salute that carried the weight of their shared history. Their eyes held a complex tapestry of emotions: grief for the brothers they'd lost, honor for the man who'd led them, and reverence for the miracle of his survival. Frank remained silent, his expression an enigma. He didn't return their salutes, but his eyes followed each man, taking in their faces, their postures, the unspoken stories they carried. Beneath his stoic exterior, a storm of emotions churned. He felt the weight of their gazes, the burden of their expectations, and the quiet pain of being seen after so many years of invisibility. He wondered if they saw the man he'd been or the shell he'd become. Yet, in their salutes, he found a flicker of redemption, a reminder that he hadn't been forgotten. The townspeople began to notice the growing ritual. Shoppers heading to the farmers' market paused, their bags forgotten as they watched the silent procession of veterans. Runners slowed their pace, their footsteps faltering as they passed the oak tree where Frank sat. Conversations hushed, replaced by curious whispers and stolen glances. Someone snapped a blurry photo of Frank in the line of saluting veterans, posting it on Facebook with a simple caption, "Does anyone know who this man really is?" The post exploded, shared and reshared until it seemed the entire town was buzzing with questions. Was he a war hero? Part of a secret unit? Rumors swirled. Some said he'd saved an entire squad in Vietnam. Others whispered he had been abandoned by the government, left to wander alone. Speculation gave way to awe. People who had once crossed the street to avoid Frank's weathered figure now lingered near his bench, their curiosity tinged with reverence. Some brought him coffee, placing it gently beside him as if offering a small token of gratitude. Others watched from a distance, unsure of what they were witnessing, but certain it was significant. The town, once blind to the man who had sat quietly among them for years, was waking up to a truth it had long ignored. Beneath the growing crowd, beneath the weight of their collective gaze, Frank Holloway remained as he always had, silent, still, and waiting, a sentinel of memories too heavy to speak. The next morning dawned pale and gray, the last chill of early dawn clinging to the air. Riverside Park stirred to life with its usual rhythm, dog walkers tugging at leashes, joggers cutting through the mist, elderly couples strolling hand in hand. Frank sat beneath his tree, unchanged, his presence as constant as the sunrise. But by 8:15 a.m., something shifted. A sound began to build, distant at first, like the rumble of an approaching storm. It grew louder, deeper, a resonant thrum that vibrated through the ground and rattled windows. Birds scattered from the trees, their wings beating frantically against the sky. People froze, turning toward the horizon, shielding their eyes against the pale morning light. Then they saw it, a UH-60 Blackhawk helicopter, its matte black form slicing through the air, a specter of the past descending on the quiet park. High above the sleepy town, a helicopter sliced through the morning sky, its blades carving the air with a relentless thrum that echoed off the rooftops below. It descended with deliberate grace, hovering for a moment over Riverside Park, where the sudden gust from its rotors sent leaves spiraling and dust clouds billowing, startling the handful of early risers scattered across the green. Children froze mid-play, their wide eyes tracking the machine with a mix of wonder and fear, their squeals piercing the air like tiny alarms. Drivers slammed on brakes, tires screeching as cars halted in the middle of the street. Hands fumbled for phones, trembling with the thrill of capturing something extraordinary. Something that felt like it had been ripped from the pages of a movie script. The helicopter, sleek and ominous, eased itself down onto the grassy field just beyond the ancient elm trees, their gnarled branches swaying as if bowing to the machine's presence. The landing gear kissed the earth with a soft, muffled thud, and though the blades slowed, their low hum persisted, a reminder that this was no ordinary moment. The side door slid open with a mechanical hiss, and out stepped 4 soldiers, each clad in tactical gear that seemed to absorb the light around them. Their faces, hidden behind tinted goggles, betrayed no emotion, no flicker of doubt. They moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, every step calculated, every gesture purposeful, as if they had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in some distant training ground. They fanned out across the field, forming a tight perimeter, their boots pressing into the soft grass, kicking up faint clouds of dust that caught the morning sun and shimmered like fleeting ghosts. The crowd, now growing, stood transfixed. A jogger paused mid-stride, her breath catching in her throat. A shopkeeper, apron still tied from the morning rush, gripped the edge of his doorframe, his heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and unease. Veterans from the previous day's memorial lingered near the park's edge, their weathered faces tightening with something unspoken, as if they recognized the weight of what was unfolding. From the helicopter's shadowed interior, a fifth figure emerged, his presence commanding even before he stepped fully into the light. He was a man in his late 50s, his sharply pressed dress uniform adorned with a cascade of medals and insignia that glinted like stars against the dark fabric. Silver streaked his temples, and the lines etched around his eyes spoke of battles fought, secrets kept, and burdens carried through decades of silence. He stood tall, his posture radiating authority, yet there was a quiet heaviness to him, as if he bore the weight of stories no one else could fathom. His gaze swept the field, not with arrogance but with purpose, as though he had come to right a wrong long buried. The crowd swelled, a mix of park-goers, curious locals, and those drawn by the spectacle. Their whispers fell silent, their breaths held, as if speaking might shatter the fragile sanctity of the moment. No one dared approach. No one dared question. All eyes followed the officer as he strode across the grass, his steps measured but unwavering, toward a lone figure seated on a weathered bench at the edge of the field. Frank sat there, an old man whose quiet presence had long blended into the town's daily rhythm. He was still, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on the sky as if he had known this day would come, as if he had been waiting for it all along. His face, weathered by time and unspoken grief, held a quiet resolve, but beneath it churned a storm of memories, moments of valor and loss, of promises made and broken, of a life lived in the shadows of a world that had moved on without him. The officer stopped before Frank, and for a moment, time seemed to pause. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of what was about to unfold. The officer removed his cap with a reverence that felt almost sacred, his head bowing slightly as he spoke, his voice steady but laced with a deference that sent a ripple through the onlookers. "Sir," he said, "we apologize for keeping you waiting." The words landed like a stone in still water, sending shockwaves through the crowd. A woman gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. A child, clutching his mother's hand, whispered, "Did he just say sir?" The veterans at the park's edge exchanged glances, their eyes narrowing as fragments of old stories stirred in their minds. Frank blinked slowly, his gaze rising to meet the officer's. For several long seconds, no words passed between them, but the silence spoke louder than any speech could. It was as if the years, decades of forgotten promises, of quiet sacrifices, folded into that single moment, the past and present collapsing into one another. Frank's heart, weathered but unbroken, thudded in his chest. He had carried the weight of his past alone for so long. Each day on that bench, a quiet vigil, a refusal to let go of who he had been. And now, here they were, acknowledging him, seeing him after all this time. One of the soldiers stepped forward, his movements precise yet gentle, offering a folded cloth, a pristine service jacket, its fabric crisp and heavy with significance. Frank didn't move at first, his hand still resting in his lap, his eyes tracing the jacket as if it were a relic from another life. Then slowly he rose to his feet. There was no stiffness in his movements, only a quiet dignity, the kind that comes from years of standing tall in the face of oblivion. He took the jacket, his fingers brushing the fabric with a tenderness that betrayed the emotions swirling within him. Pride, sorrow, and a flicker of something like redemption. He draped it carefully over his arm, his posture straightening, not with the rigidity of a soldier, but with the quiet grace of a man reclaiming a piece of himself. Without a word, Frank followed the officer back toward the helicopter, the soldiers falling into step around them, their perimeter unbroken. The crowd remained frozen, some still clutching their phones, though many had lowered them, their instincts telling them that this moment was too profound, too raw, to be reduced to a fleeting video. No one cheered, no one clapped. They simply watched, their hearts heavy with the weight of something they could not fully understand, but knew was sacred. The helicopter's ramp closed with a soft clank, and the blades roared back to life, lifting the machine into the sky. Dust swirled once more, settling over the field like a quiet farewell. The town would never look at that bench the same way again. Whatever they had thought they knew about the quiet old man who sat there day after day, They now understood he was no ordinary figure. He had not been forgotten, only misplaced, until this moment. As the helicopter vanished beyond the horizon, the spell over the park broke. Whispers turned to murmurs, then to a flood of questions. By noon, news vans rolled into town, their antennas piercing the sky like eager sentinels. Reporters set up in the park, their voices hurried and breathless as they spoke into cameras, trying to capture the weight of what had just happened. Social media erupted with shaky footage and grainy photos, each post fueling a growing wave of speculation. The story was too strange, too cinematic, to be ignored. But it wasn't until the Department of Defense stepped forward with a press conference that the truth began to take shape, though even then, it carried the weight of mystery, of a man whose quiet life had hidden a legacy too vast for the town to have ever imagined. The truth unfurled like a long-buried secret at a Pentagon press conference, the room heavy with anticipation. Two American flags stood sentinel behind the podium, their stars and stripes framing a senior Pentagon spokesperson, flanked by stone-faced military officials. What began as a routine briefing morphed into a revelation that would ripple through history, leaving journalists, veterans, and a nation grappling with awe and sorrow. The spokesperson's voice, steady yet weighted, cut through the murmurs. Yesterday, the United States military re-established contact with Captain Franklin T. Holloway, former commander of Echo Unit 6, a covert reconnaissance team long presumed lost during a classified operation in Southeast Asia in 1978. A ripple of shock coursed through the room, pencils pausing mid-scribble, cameras clicking furiously. For nearly half a century, Captain Holloway had been a ghost, officially listed as missing in action, presumed dead after his elite team vanished during a perilous mission deep in the jungles of Laos. That operation, shrouded in secrecy, unfolded in the waning days of the Vietnam War, a time when the region pulsed with chaos and betrayal. The spokesperson's words painted a vivid picture of a man who defied fate, a commander whose choices would etch his name into the annals of sacrifice. Holloway's unit, the spokesperson revealed, had been ambushed in a brutal clash with enemy forces. The mission, already fraught with danger, turned catastrophic as 5 of his men were taken captive. Holloway, a leader forged in the crucible of war, faced an impossible decision. Retreat was an option, extraction a faint possibility, but his heart, tethered to his men, refused to yield. Instead, he vanished into the enemy's domain, choosing to remain behind lines in a solitary quest to save his team. The room grew still as the spokesperson described Holloway's weeks of relentless pursuit, a lone figure navigating a treacherous landscape. He tracked his captured men with the precision of a predator, gathering scraps of intelligence, slipping through enemy patrols, his body battered, but his resolve unyielding. Hunger gnawed at him. Fear whispered in the quiet moments. Yet he pressed on, driven by a loyalty that burned brighter than self-preservation. Against all odds, Holloway succeeded. He infiltrated the enemy's hold and liberated 4 of his 5 men. The 5th, tragically, had been executed, a loss that would haunt him, though he never spoke of it. Leading the survivors through the jungle, Holloway became their shield, their guide, their hope. Without radio contact, they survived on what the land offered, evading capture through sheer grit and cunning. By the time they stumbled into the arms of friendly forces, they were shadows of themselves, gaunt and broken, but alive. Holloway, however, refused to cross that final threshold to safety. In a moment that baffled his men, he entrusted them to a secondary unit and turned back toward the jungle's embrace. He chose exile over acclaim, disappearing into the wilderness, his heart too heavy to accept the hero's mantle. The press corps leaned forward, hungry for answers. Why had he vanished? Why had the Pentagon remained silent for so long? The spokesperson's pause was palpable, a moment of reverence for a man who had borne unspeakable burdens. Captain Holloway suffered from what we now recognize as severe combat-related PTSD, they explained, voice softening. In 1978, the term barely existed. The stigma of mental wounds was a silent shackle for veterans of Holloway's era. He shunned medals, recoiled from the spotlight, and found no solace in the military's offers of aid. Instead, he slipped back into the United States under a new identity, a deliberate act of erasure. He became a wanderer, a man unmoored from the world that had shaped him. For decades, Holloway drifted across the American landscape, a specter in plain sight. Montana's rugged mountains, Texas's sprawling plains, New Mexico's sun-scorched deserts. He left faint traces in each, never lingering. He lived simply, taking up odd jobs, ranch hand, mechanic, drifter, his hands calloused, his eyes guarded. He refused interviews, deflected questions, and buried his past beneath layers of anonymity. To those who crossed his path, he was a quiet stranger, a man whose story seemed to hum just beneath the surface, unspoken. Yet inside, Holloway carried the weight of his choices. The faces of his men, both the saved and the lost, lingered in his dreams. The jungle's whispers followed him, a reminder of the peace he could never quite grasp. His anonymity might have endured forever, but fate intervened. A photograph, innocuous at first, surfaced online. Holloway standing beside a Black Hawk helicopter in Riverside Park, his posture weary but proud. A sharp-eyed military intelligence officer noticed a detail, a unique cloth bracelet on his wrist, woven exclusively for members of Echo Unit 6. That single thread unraveled decades of secrecy. Within hours, the Pentagon launched a fevered investigation. Fingerprint records were cross-checked. DNA from an old Army file confirmed the impossible. Franklin Holloway was no longer a ghost. He was Captain Holloway, commander of one of the most enigmatic and revered units in military history, a war hero whose nation had never had the chance to thank. As the press conference drew to a close, the room buzzed with questions. One reporter's voice rose above the din. "Will Captain Holloway be awarded the Medal of Honor?" The spokesperson's gaze softened, reflecting the complexity of the man they described. "The Department of Defense is reviewing the matter," they said. "But from what we've learned, Captain Holloway never sought medals. He sought peace." Those words hung in the air, a poignant truth about a man who had given everything, not for glory, but for the men he called brothers, and for a quiet corner of the world where his wounds might finally rest. The weight of a lifetime pressed heavily on Frank Holloway as he returned to Riverside Park, not with fanfare or expectation, but with a quiet resolve that whispered of a man who had exhausted his solitude. It wasn't glory that drew him back. Age had carved lines of weariness into his face, and the ghosts of a life spent in the margins haunted his steps. Perhaps it was the ache of unspoken stories, the need to be known, not as a hero but as a man who had carried burdens in silence. Beneath the sprawling branches of the old elm tree, where he once sat unnoticed, Frank's presence lingered like a shadow that had finally found its light. Weeks drifted by, but the memory of what had happened in that park refused to fade. The city, stirred by the revelation of Frank's quiet existence, replaced his weathered spot with a polished stone bench. It stood unassuming yet proud, a testament to a man who had never sought recognition. A bronze plaque gleamed softly, etched with the words, "Frank Holloway, the silent keeper of peace." Below, in smaller script, a tribute to those who served without demanding to be seen. The bench became a beacon, drawing people at dawn's first light. Veterans arrived first, some in faded uniforms, others in worn jackets, standing in quiet reverence. Their eyes traced the plaque, seeing in it their own unspoken sacrifices. Teachers soon followed, guiding students to the flagpole nearby, where young voices fell silent, hands brushing brows in salute or simply resting at their sides. What began as a quiet gesture grew into a daily ritual, a collective act of remembrance that wove itself into the fabric of the town. Liam Carson, a boy whose curiosity had unraveled Frank's story, stood at the heart of this change. Known now as the one who brought truth to light, he was invited to speak at the school's Veterans Day Assembly. The gymnasium buzzed with anticipation, but Liam's heart pounded as he climbed the stage, his palms sweaty around a crumpled sheet of paper. His voice trembled, cracking under the weight of the moment. "My name is Liam," he began, his words tentative but earnest. "I want to tell you about someone who didn't live in a big house or wear shiny medals. He lived on a bench. He didn't talk much. People thought he had nothing, but he had given everything." He held up a faded cloth bracelet, its threads worn but heavy with meaning. "Some heroes don't wear armor," he said, his voice steadier now, fueled by conviction. "Some don't even want to be called heroes. They carry a sleeping bag, eyes that have seen too much, and they ask for nothing in return. The room fell still. Parents shifted in their seats, their eyes glistening with memories of their own quiet heroes. Students, usually restless, stood frozen, absorbing the weight of Liam's words. Veterans in the back, their faces etched with years of service, nodded silently, their hearts recognizing a truth they'd long carried. Liam's voice grew softer, but it carried a quiet power. We walked past him for years. We didn't look, but he never stopped watching over us. Now that we see him, let's never forget him. As he stepped down, the silence lingered, heavy with reflection, a shared understanding that some sacrifices are felt long before they are seen. Frank Holloway had vanished again, taken into the care of the military that had once lost sight of him. Yet his presence remained, rooted deeply in the town's heart. The bench stood as a quiet monument, not to grand gestures or loud parades, but to a man who had lived humbly and served silently. His story, once overlooked, now pulsed through the community, a reminder to pause, to look closer, to see the unseen. In a world quick to judge by appearances, Frank's legacy challenged everyone to slow down and wonder, who else have we missed? The veteran waiting in line at the grocery store, his cap faded but his posture still proud. The janitor sweeping the school halls, unnoticed but ever present. The elderly man at the diner, his hands trembling as he sips his coffee, his eyes holding stories no one has asked to hear. For those who have lived through decades of change, Frank's story strikes a tender chord. They know the weight of service without applause, the quiet dignity of lives spent in the background. Some may have known a Frank Holloway, a neighbor, a friend, or even themselves, whose sacrifices went unnoticed until time or chance brought them to light. For younger hearts, the lesson is just as vital: to listen, to respect, to withhold judgment until the full story unfolds. Frank's bench, simple as it was, became a mirror, reflecting the overlooked heroes in every corner of life. His story, carried forward by a boy's trembling voice and a town's awakened conscience, ensured that no one would pass by so carelessly again.